She was 19 and homeless. No family left who would claim her. No money beyond what she could carry in a coffee tin. Just a wool blanket that had belonged to her grandmother and 3 copper coins that together amounted to exactly $3. And with that $3, she bought an abandoned homestead at the far end of the Corbin Valley. A place so forgotten that even the county assessor had crossed it off his ledger with a single line of ink. But what nobody knew, not the clerk who sold it, not the ranchers who rode past it without looking, not even the woman who would pry up the rotted planks with her own hands, was that beneath those floorboards lay something that would change her life and the life of every person in that valley forever. If you have not yet subscribed to this channel, take a moment now, because this story is one you will want to hear from beginning to end. Her name was Ilara Kane, and she was born on the 7th of March in a narrow clapboard house on the outskirts of Harlan, a mill town pressed into the crease between 2 ridges where the Elk River ran shallow over limestone. Her father was Thomas Kane, a timber cruiser who walked the high forests marking trees for the Harlan Lumber Company. And her mother was Josephine Kane, née Pruitt, who had come to Harlan at 17 to work in the company store, and who married Thomas 6 months later in a ceremony attended by 11 people and a dog that belonged to no one in particular. Ilara was their second child. Her brother David was 4 years older and quiet in the way that oldest children in poor families often are, carrying responsibilities he never asked for with a patience that looked, from the outside, like indifference. The family was not destitute, but they were close enough to it that the difference was academic. Thomas earned 40 cents a day plus board when he was in the field, and Josephine took in mending and kept a kitchen garden that fed them through the summers and, when the canning went well, into the early months of winter. They owned the house but not the land beneath it, which was leased from the lumber company at a rate that rose a little every year, the way water rises in a cellar, slowly enough that you do not notice until your boots are wet. Ilara's childhood was shaped by 2 things: work and her grandmother, Bet Pruitt, who lived alone in a cabin 4 miles up the ridge road, and who was, by any honest accounting, the most capable person Ilara ever knew. Bet had been widowed at 31 when her husband, a man named Orrin Pruitt, was killed by a falling spruce during a windstorm in the winter of 1847. She had raised Josephine and Josephine's 2 brothers alone on that ridge, growing potatoes and turnips in soil so rocky. She once told Ilara that she could have planted a stone and harvested a boulder. Bet was small and lean, and her hands were the hands of someone who had never stopped working. The knuckles swollen, the fingers curved slightly inward even at rest, the skin across her palms as thick and smooth as saddle leather. She wore her white hair in a single braid that hung to the middle of her back, and she had a way of looking at you when you spoke that made you feel that every word you said was being weighed and measured and stored somewhere permanent. It was Bet who taught Ilara to use tools, not in the way that children are sometimes taught, handed a hammer and told to tap gently at a nail already started, but properly, with seriousness and expectation. By the time Ilara was 10, she could sharpen a draw knife on an oilstone, true the edge of a plane blade, and split a shingle from a cedar bolt with a froe and mallet. By 12, she could hang a door so that it swung true and latched clean, and she could read the grain of a board well enough to know which face to put up and which to put down, and where the wood would want to cup if you let it dry unevenly. Bette taught her these things not with lectures, but with demonstration and correction, standing beside her at the workbench in the little shed behind the cabin, guiding Ilara's hands with her own when the angle was wrong, saying only, "Feel that? That is the wood telling you where it wants to go." Bet believed that every material had a nature, and that the job of the person working it was to understand that nature and cooperate with it rather than fight it, and she extended this philosophy to people as well, though she was less patient with people than she was with wood. When Alara was 14, her father was injured in the forest. A dead limb, what the timbermen called a widowmaker, fell from a hemlock and struck him across the shoulders, and though it did not kill him, it broke something in his back that never healed correctly. He came home on a stretcher made from 2 poles and a canvas sheet, and he never walked into the forest again. The lumber company gave him nothing. No payment, no pension, no acknowledgement beyond a notation in the foreman's ledger that read, T. Kane, retired from service. Thomas spent the next 2 years in a chair by the window, growing thinner and quieter, and Josephine worked longer hours at the mending and took on laundry as well. And David, who was 18 by then, went to work at the mill itself, feeding logs into the saw carriage for 35 cents a day. Alara divided her time between the house, where she cooked and cleaned and tended her father, and Bet's cabin, where she continued to learn. It was during this period that Bet gave her the object she would carry for the rest of her life. A small folding knife with a bone handle and a blade that had been reground so many times, it was narrow as a willow leaf. It had belonged to Orrin Pruitt. Bet placed it in Alara's palm one afternoon without ceremony and said, "He would have liked you. You pay attention the way he did." Alara closed her fingers around it and felt the warmth of the bone and the weight of the brass bolsters, and she understood that she was being given something that could not be replaced. Thomas Kane died in the autumn of that year, on a Tuesday, with the windows open and the smell of wood smoke coming in from somewhere down the road. He was 43 years old. Josephine sold the house, or rather, surrendered it back to the lumber company in exchange for the cancellation of 2 years of back rent, and moved with David into a boarding house in town. Alara went to live with Bet for 2 years, from the time she was 15 until she was 17. Alara lived in the ridge cabin, and those were, she would later say, the best years of her life. She and Bet worked side by side every day, mending the cabin, tending the garden, cutting firewood, putting up food for winter. Bet taught her to lay a stone foundation, to mix lime mortar, to read weather in the movement of birds and the color of the sky at evening. They did not talk a great deal, but the silence between them was the silence of 2 people who understood each other completely. And when they did speak, it was usually about the work at hand, and the words were precise and practical and sufficient. Bet died 2 weeks after Alara's 17th birthday. She died in her sleep, in the bed she had shared with Orrin Pruitt 50 years earlier. And when Alara found her in the morning, she was lying on her side with one hand tucked beneath her cheek and the other resting on the quilt. And she looked, Alara thought, like someone who had simply decided she was finished. Alara washed her and dressed her in her good wool dress and wrapped her in the quilt and buried her beside Orrin in the little plot behind the cabin, digging the grave herself in ground that was half frozen and full of roots, working for 6 hours with a pick and a shovel until the hole was deep enough and straight enough to satisfy her. She did not cry. She stood beside the grave and said, "Thank you for everything you taught me." And then she went inside and sat at the workbench and held the bone-handled knife in both hands and was still for a long time. She stayed in the cabin for nearly 2 years after that, living alone, keeping the garden, doing odd work for neighbors when there were neighbors who needed it. She was not unhappy, but she was alone in a way that went deeper than solitude, because the person who had known her best was gone, and the people who remained, her mother, her brother, had become strangers to her in the slow way that people become strangers when they stop sharing daily life. She visited Josephine and David at the boarding house once a month, walking the 4 miles down the ridge and the 2 miles into town, and each visit was a little shorter and a little more strained than the one before. Josephine had taken up with a man named Gerald Foss, a clerk at the feed store, who wore a pressed collar and who looked at Ilara as though she were something tracked in on a boot sole. David had married a girl named Catherine, and they had a room of their own at the boarding house and a baby on the way, and David's eyes, when he looked at Ilara, held the particular discomfort of someone who loves you but cannot afford to show it. It was Gerald Foss who ended it, not with violence, not with shouting, but with the quiet, administrative cruelty of a man who understood that power is most effective when it is exercised calmly. Ilara came down from the ridge on a Saturday in late October, the month she turned 19, and found the door of the boarding house locked. A note had been pinned to the frame with a tack. It was written in Gerald's careful clerk's hand, and it said, "Ilara, your mother and I have discussed the matter, and we feel it is best for everyone if you make your own arrangements going forward. Your belongings are in the box by the step. We wish you well." There was a wooden crate beside the door containing a change of clothes, a pair of wool stockings, her grandmother's blanket, and the coffee tin in which she kept her savings, $3 in copper coins. That was all. No signature from her mother. No word from David. Just the note and the box and the locked door and the sound of someone moving behind the curtained window who did not come out. Ilara read the note once. She folded it and placed it in the pocket of her coat. She knelt beside the crate and transferred its contents into the blanket, which she rolled and tied with a length of cord, and she slung the bundle over her shoulder and picked up the coffee tin and stood for a moment looking at the door. She did not knock. She did not call out. She did not cry. She turned and walked down the steps and into the road, and she did not look back. And if anyone in the boarding house watched her go, they did so from behind the curtain, which is the way that cowardice always watches courage, from a safe distance, through a veil. She walked west, because west was the direction she happened to be facing when she reached the end of the road and had to choose. The afternoon was cold and dry, and the sky was the color of pewter, and the wind came down from the ridges carrying the smell of pine resin and frozen earth. She followed the main road for 3 miles until it forked, and she took the left fork because it was narrower and quieter and led away from town rather than toward the next one, and she walked along it as the light changed from gray to gold to the deep amber of late afternoon. The road descended through a stand of ponderosa pine, the trunks tall and straight and orange-barked in the low light. And then it crossed a creek on a bridge made of 3 hewn logs laid side by side, and the water beneath was clear and fast, and she could see the stones on the bottom, each one distinct. And she stopped on the bridge and drank from her cupped hands, and the water was so cold it made her teeth ache. Beyond the creek, the road climbed again, switchbacking up a long slope covered in bunch grass and sage. And at the top of the slope, the land opened out into a valley she had never seen before. It was wide and long and bounded on 3 sides by mountains, whose upper slopes were dark with timber and whose peaks held the last of the season's snow. A river ran through the center of the valley, not large but steady, catching the late light in a way that made it look like a ribbon of hammered tin laid across the brown and gold of the grass. There were ranches scattered along the valley floor. She could see the dark shapes of barns and the thin lines of fences and the occasional smudge of chimney smoke. But they were widely spaced, separated by miles of open land, and the overall impression was one of enormous quiet. She stood at the top of the slope and looked out at it and felt something shift in her chest. Not hope exactly, but the space where hope could be if she let it. She descended into the valley as the sun set behind the western ridge, and the shadows of the mountains stretched across the grass like dark water filling a basin. And by the time she reached the valley floor, the air had turned cold enough that she could see her breath. She walked along the river road for another mile and came to a small settlement. 4 buildings clustered at a crossroads, none of them large. There was a general store with a porch and a hitching rail, a blacksmith shop with its forge cold and dark, a building that might have been a church or a schoolhouse, and a low stone structure with a sign that read, Corbin Valley Land Office, J.R. Hadley, Assessor. The store was closed, but there was lamplight in the window of the land office, and Alara walked toward it because light, in that moment, meant the possibility of warmth and information, and perhaps a direction to go next. She pushed open the door and stepped into a room that was small and close and heated by a cast-iron stove in the corner. Behind a desk made of rough-sawn pine sat a man of perhaps 60, with white hair cut short and spectacles that sat low on his nose, and a ledger book open before him that was so large it covered most of the desk. He looked up when she entered and studied her for a moment. The bundle on her shoulder, the coffee tin in her hand, the mud on her boots, the steadiness of her gaze. And he said, "You look like you have walked a long way." "I have," she said. His name was James Hadley, and he had been the county assessor for the Corbin Valley for 22 years, and he knew every parcel of land in the valley the way a shepherd knows every sheep in his flock, by name and location and history and temperament. He offered her a chair and a cup of coffee from the pot on the stove, and he listened while she explained, in as few words as possible, that she was looking for land. She did not tell him why she was alone or where she had come from or what had happened at the boarding house door. She simply said she had $3 and she wanted to know if $3 could buy anything in the Corbin Valley. Hadley removed his spectacles and cleaned them on his sleeve and replaced them and looked at her again with an expression that was not pity but something closer to recognition, as though he had seen someone like her before and remembered how that story had gone. He turned the pages of his ledger slowly, running his finger down columns of figures. And after a long moment, he stopped and tapped a line of ink and said, "There is one property, the Holm place, 40 acres at the head of the East Fork, with a cabin and a root cellar and a well. It has been abandoned for 11 years. The county has been carrying the taxes, and nobody has ever come to claim it. The total owed is $2.80. He looked at her over his spectacles. $3 would cover it with 20 cents to spare. Alara set the coffee tin on the desk and opened it and counted out the coins. 30 copper pieces, each one worn smooth. And she pushed them across the pine surface toward James Hadley, and he counted them again and wrote a receipt in his ledger and tore it out and handed it to her. And just like that, for the price of $3, Alara Kane became the owner of 40 acres of land she had never seen, a cabin she had never entered, and whatever lay within it and beneath it and around it, known and unknown, visible and hidden. She reached the Holm place the following morning, having slept that night in the land office on a blanket Hadley spread beside the stove. He had drawn her a map on the back of a tax notice. Follow the river road east for 4 miles. Take the right fork where the cottonwoods grow in a line. Follow the creek upstream for another 2 miles until you see the cabin on the north bank. And the map was precise, and she found the place without difficulty, arriving just as the morning sun cleared the eastern ridge and poured down into the narrow valley of the East Fork like something liquid and golden being tipped from a bowl. The cabin stood in a clearing on a slight rise above the creek, and the first thing Alara noticed was the roof. It was cedar shake, or had been, but time and weather had worked on it until the shakes were curled and split and gray as old bone. and in several places they had fallen away entirely, leaving gaps through which she could see the dark interior. The cabin itself was built of hewn logs, each one roughly 10 inches square, notched at the corners in a saddle joint that had been cut with care. She could see that even from a distance. The chinking between the logs was mostly gone, fallen out in long crumbling strips, and the gaps let in light and wind and rain. But the logs themselves were sound. They were lodgepole pine, straight-grained and dense, and whatever the years had done to the roof and the chinking, the bones of the structure were good. The cabin was perhaps 16 feet by 20, a single room with a door on the south side and 2 windows, one east and one west, both of which had lost their glass. A stone chimney rose from the north wall, built of river rock laid in courses, and it was intact except for the very top, where 2 or 3 stones had fallen and lay in the grass below like teeth knocked from a jaw. She walked around the cabin slowly, looking at everything. The door hung on leather hinges that had dried and cracked, but still held, and when she pushed it open, it swung inward with a sound like a long exhalation. Inside, the cabin was dim and cold, and smelled of earth and old wood and something faintly sweet that might have been dried wildflowers, or might have been the particular scent of a place that has been closed up and left to its own slow processes for more than a decade. The floor was made of wide pine planks, hand-planed, laid across joists that rested on a foundation of stacked stone. Some of the planks had warped and lifted, and in one corner near the fireplace a section of floor had buckled upward as though something beneath it were pressing from below. There was a table against the west wall, still standing, made of the same pine as the floor, and a single chair beside it that had lost one leg and leaned against the wall at an angle. A shelf above the fireplace held 3 tin cups, a candle stub, and a small glass bottle with something dried inside it. Wildflowers, she thought, or herbs. The fireplace itself was deep and wide, the firebox blackened with years of use, and the hearthstone was a single slab of gray granite, smooth and flat, that extended 2 feet into the room. She set her bundle on the table and stood in the center of the room and turned slowly, looking at everything with the eyes Bet had trained her to use. Eyes that saw not what a thing was, but what it could become. The roof needed replacing entirely. The chinking needed to be redone from foundation to eaves. The windows needed glass or oiled paper, or at least shutters that could be closed against the weather. The floor needed to be pulled up and relaid where it had warped. The chimney needed its missing stones replaced. The door needed new hinges. But the walls were sound, and the foundation was solid, and the fireplace drew well. She could tell by the pattern of soot on the stones. And the location was good, sheltered from the north wind by the rise of the hill, with water close and timber closer, and a southern exposure that would catch the winter sun. It was, she thought, a good place. It was a place that had been loved once and then left, and it was waiting, with the patience that only empty buildings have, for someone to love it again. She began with the floor. It was the practical choice. You cannot repair a roof if the surface you stand on shifts beneath your feet. And it was also the choice her grandmother would have made, because Bet Pruitt believed that everything in a house starts with what is underfoot, that the foundation and the floor are the truth of a structure, and everything above them is just conversation. Ilara knelt beside the buckled section near the fireplace and ran her fingers along the seam where 2 planks had lifted and separated, and she could feel the draft coming up from below, cold and damp and carrying the mineral smell of earth that has not seen sunlight in years. She took the bone-handled knife from her pocket and opened it and slid the blade into the seam and worked it back and forth, gently, the way Bet had taught her to work a joint apart without splitting the wood. And the first plank came up with a groan and a release of dust that hung in the morning light like something alive. Beneath the plank was darkness, and beneath the darkness was the packed earth of the crawl space, and she could see the stone piers on which the joists rested, each one stacked carefully, flat river rocks chosen for their uniformity and laid without mortar, but with a precision that spoke of someone who understood weight and balance. She pulled up the second plank, and then the third, working her way along the buckled section, and it was when she lifted the fourth plank, the one closest to the hearthstone, that she saw it. Not immediately. At first it was just a shape in the shadows, something that did not belong to the geometry of stone and earth and wood. She leaned closer, and her eyes adjusted, and she saw that someone had dug a shallow cavity in the earth between two of the stone piers. A rectangular hole, perhaps 18 inches long and 12 inches wide and 8 inches deep. And into this cavity they had placed a tin box. The box was the kind that had once held tea or biscuits, rectangular with a fitted lid, and it was dark with tarnish but intact. She reached down and lifted it out, and it was heavier than she expected, and when she set it on the floor beside her and brushed the dirt from its surface, she could see that the lid had been sealed with a strip of waxed cloth pressed into the seam, and whoever had done this had done it with the intention that the contents would survive. She peeled the waxed cloth away carefully, working the edge with her knife, and she lifted the lid and looked inside. There were 3 things in the box. The first was money, coins, mostly silver, some gold, stacked in neat columns and wrapped in scraps of cloth to keep them from shifting. She did not count them then, but she would later, and the total would come to $147, a sum so large that when she finally understood it, she would sit very still for a long time with her hands in her lap. The second thing was a small object wrapped in a piece of soft leather. She set it aside for the moment. The third thing, resting on top of the coins, was a letter. It was written on a single sheet of paper that had been folded twice and sealed with a drop of candle wax. And the paper was yellowed but dry, and the ink was brown but legible. And Alara unfolded it and held it in the light from the open door and read it. The letter said this: "My name is Annika Holm. I am 53 years old, and I have lived in this cabin for 21 years, since my husband Eric and I built it together in the spring of 1841. Eric died in the winter of 1849 from a fever that took him in 3 days, and I have lived here alone since then. I am writing this letter because I am leaving. My body is tired, and my eyes are failing, and I cannot keep the place any longer, and I am going to my sister in Salem, and I do not expect I will return. I am leaving this money because I earned it honestly, by my own labor, selling butter and eggs and garden seed to the people of this valley for 21 years, and because I have no children to leave it to, and no one who needs it more than whoever comes next. If you are reading this, then you have come to this place, and you have lifted these boards, and you have found what I left for you. I do not know who you are. I do not know if you are young or old, man or woman, rich or poor. But I know this: you are here, and this place needs someone, and maybe you need it too. Take the money and use it well. Fix the roof. It was already leaking when I left. Replace the chinking on the north wall first, because that is where the wind comes hardest. The well is good. The soil along the creek is the best soil in the valley for growing things. I have left you one other thing, which belonged to Eric. He carved it during our first winter here, when the snow was deep and the nights were long, and he wanted to make something beautiful for no reason other than that beauty is worth making. I hope you will keep it. I hope you will be happy here. I hope this place will be as good to you as it was to me. Annika Holm, October 1862. Ilara read the letter twice. Then she set it down on the floor beside her and unwrapped the soft leather bundle. And inside was a small carved wooden bird, a meadowlark, no larger than her thumb, rendered with extraordinary delicacy. The feathers suggested by fine lines cut with a knife point, the beak slightly open as though it were about to sing, the eyes 2 tiny dots of darker wood inlaid into the pale body. It had been carved from a piece of birch, and the wood had aged to the color of honey, and it was warm in her hand the way that wood is always warm, warmer than metal, warmer than stone, holding whatever heat you give it and returning it slowly. She held it for a long time. Then she placed it on the shelf above the fireplace, beside the 3 tin cups and the glass bottle, and she placed Annika Holm's letter beside it, and she sat on the floor of the cabin with the tin box of coins in her lap, and the morning light coming through the open door, and she was quiet and still, and she did not cry, but something in her face changed, softened, opened, the way a door opens when someone on the other side has finally found the key. She began the repairs that same afternoon. The money meant she could buy materials she could not make or find. Glass for the windows, nails, a new axe head to replace the one she found in the shed behind the cabin rusted beyond saving. But the labor would be her own, and she wanted it that way, because work was the language she spoke most fluently, and because every board she planned and every stone she set would be a conversation between herself and this place, between herself and Annika Holm, between herself and Bet Pruitt, between her own 2 hands and the future she was building with them. She started with the roof, despite Annika's advice about the north wall, because a house without a roof is not a house but a suggestion, and the autumn rains would come soon. She felled cedar in the stand behind the cabin, selecting trees of the right diameter, and she bucked them into bolts 20 inches long and split shakes from each bolt with the froe she found hanging on a peg in the shed, its handle worn smooth by Annika's hands or Eric's hands or both. The froe was a good one, the blade still true, and Ilara sharpened it on a flat stone from the creek and began splitting. Each shake came off the bolt with a clean, fibrous tear, and she stacked them in rows to dry for 3 days before carrying them up the ladder she built from 2 lodgepole pines and cross pieces lashed with rawhide. She stripped the old shakes and replaced the damaged lath beneath them, and laid the new shakes in overlapping courses, starting from the eaves and working upward, each course offset from the one below so that the water would run from shake to shake and never find a seam to enter. It took her 11 days to finish the roof, working from first light until the light failed, and when it was done, she stood in the clearing and looked up at it, and it was tight and even and good. The chinking came next, and it was during this work that the first of the valley people found her. His name was Orrin Calloway. The coincidence of the first name was not lost on her, and he was 61 years old, and he ranched 320 acres 4 miles down the creek, running cattle and a small band of sheep. And he had ridden up the East Fork to check on a section of fence, and had seen the smoke from her chimney, and come to investigate because no smoke had risen from the Holm place in over a decade. He sat on his horse and watched her for a full minute as she mixed lime and sand and clay in a wooden trough. And then he dismounted and tied his horse to the fence post and walked over and looked at her mortar and said, "You need more eat." "I know," she said. "I am stretching what I have." He rode away without another word, and returned 2 hours later with a 50-pound sack of lime across his saddle, and set it on the ground beside her trough, and said, "That should help," and rode away again. He did not ask her name. He did not ask how she had come to be there. He looked at her work and saw that it was competent, and that was enough. 3 days later, a woman named Ida Bergstrom appeared. She was 44, the wife of a wheat farmer named Carl Bergstrom, whose land lay at the wide part of the valley, and she came on foot carrying a basket covered with a cloth. Inside the basket were a loaf of bread, a jar of blackberry preserves, a wedge of hard cheese, and 6 eggs wrapped individually in scraps of wool. She set the basket on the porch and said, "I am Ida. Oren told us someone was fixing the home place. I brought you some things." Ilara thanked her, and Ida looked at the new roof and the fresh chinking on the north wall and said, "Annika would be glad." And then she walked back down the creek road, and Ilara stood on the porch holding the basket and understood that she had been seen. That word was traveling through the valley in the quiet way that word travels in places where people are spread far apart, but connected by the invisible threads of shared landscape and shared weather and shared knowledge of what it means to live at the edge of things. They came one by one over the following weeks, each bringing something specific, each staying only long enough to deliver what they had brought and to observe her work and to say a few words that were practical rather than sentimental. A man named Dawson Greaves, 37, who operated the blacksmith shop at the crossroads, rode up with a box of hand-forged nails and a new set of leather hinges for the door, and he helped her hang the door and showed her a trick for setting a hinge pin so that it would not work loose, and he told her that he had shod Eric Holmes' horses 30 years ago when he was a boy apprenticed to his father. A woman named Ruth Okafor, 29, who taught at the schoolhouse and kept bees on a 1/4 acre behind it, brought 2 panes of glass wrapped in burlap and a pot of honey and a copy of a seed catalog that was 2 years out of date but still useful. A boy named Samuel Lund, 14, whose family ranched on the west side of the valley, appeared one morning with a handcart containing a cast-iron cookpot, a skillet, and a set of tin plates, and he said his mother had sent them, and that his mother said to tell her the well water was sweet if she let it sit overnight before drinking. Ilara accepted everything with the same quiet gravity with which it was offered. She did not make speeches of gratitude. She said thank you, and she meant it, and the people who brought things understood that she meant it because they could see it in the way she handled what they gave her. Carefully, with respect, the way you handle something that matters. And she worked. She worked every day from the hour the light was strong enough to see by until the hour it was not. And the cabin changed around her the way a living thing changes when it is cared for, slowly and then all at once. The gaps closing, the surfaces smoothing, the structure tightening until it was no longer an abandoned shell but a shelter. Not yet a home, but something very close to it. Something that was waiting for the last thing that would make it one. She relaid the floor, planing each warped plank on a bench she built in the yard, working the wood with the draw knife and the hand plane until the surfaces were flat and true, and she fitted the planks back into place and pegged them to the joists with oak dowels she whittled in the evenings by the fire. She repointed the chimney, climbing a ladder with a bucket of mortar and setting each fallen stone back into its course, matching the original pattern so precisely that when she was finished, you could not tell which stones had been reset and which had never moved. She built a bed frame from lodgepole pine, lashing the joints with rawhide in the way Bet had taught her, and she stuffed a mattress tick with dried grass and wild mint and laid her grandmother's blanket over it. And the first night she slept in the bed, she slept without waking until dawn, which she had not done since Bet died. The garden she started in the strip of dark soil along the creek, turning the earth with a spade Dawson Greaves forged for her in exchange for a day's labor splitting fence rails. And she planted the seeds Ruth Okafor helped her order from the catalog. Turnips, potatoes, carrots, onions, beans, and a row of sunflowers along the south edge, because Annika's letter had mentioned beauty, and Alara thought sunflowers were the most honest kind of beauty there was, tall and obvious and unashamed. Orrin Calloway brought her 2 laying hens in a crate and refused payment and said only, "They are good layers. The brown one is mean." Ida Bergstrom taught her which wild plants along the creek were edible and which were medicinal and which were neither. And they spent an afternoon together gathering watercress and wild onion and yarrow. And Ida told her stories about the valley, who had homesteaded where, who had stayed and who had left, how the river had flooded in the spring of 1856 and taken out every bridge for 15 miles. Alara listened to all of it and stored it the way Bet had stored things, carefully, in a place where it would not be lost. By the first snowfall, the cabin was whole. The roof was tight, the walls were chinked, the windows held glass. The door swung true on its new hinges. The chimney drew clean. The floor was smooth and level and solid underfoot. The garden was put to bed for winter. The root cellar stocked with potatoes and turnips and carrots and onions and jars of preserved berries that Ida had taught her to put up. The 2 hens, she named them Josephine and Bet, which was a private joke she shared with no one, roosted in a small coop she built against the south wall of the cabin, and the brown one was indeed mean, and Alara respected her for it. There was wood stacked under the eaves, enough to last until March if she was careful, and there was water in the well, and there was food in the cellar, and there was a fire in the hearth, and there was a roof that did not leak. And these things, taken together, constituted something that Alara had not had since Bet's cabin on the ridge, something she had not dared to name until now. She sat in the chair she had repaired, the broken leg replaced with a new one she turned on a makeshift lathe, matching the taper and the grain as closely as she could, and she looked at the shelf above the fireplace. The 3 tin cups were still there, and the glass bottle with its dried flowers, and beside them now were 2 new things. Annika Holmes' letter, folded and leaning against the wall, and Eric Holmes' carved meadowlark, standing on its small flat base with its beak open to the room. And beside the meadowlark, placed there on the day she moved in and not moved since, was Orrin Pruitt's bone-handled knife, closed, resting on its side. 2 objects made by 2 people who had loved someone they never got to see grow old, left behind like messages in a language that only the right person could read. She thought about Annika Holm, who had lived in this cabin for 21 years and who had earned $147, 1 egg and 1 pound of butter at a time, and who had buried it beneath her floor, not because she was afraid, but because she believed that someone would come after her and that someone would need it. She thought about Eric Holm, who had carved a meadowlark during a long winter because beauty is worth making. She thought about Bet Pruitt, who had placed a knife in a girl's hand and said, "He would have liked you." She thought about Orrin Pruitt, who had died under a falling tree and whose knife had outlived him by decades and was still sharp and still warm in the hand. She thought about the people of the Corbin Valley, who had come to her one by one with nails and lime and bread and glass and hens and seeds and stories, not because she had asked, but because that is what people do when they recognize someone who is trying to make something out of nothing, someone who is doing the work. She did not think about Gerald Foss. She did not think about the note on the door. She did not think about the locked boarding house or the curtain that did not move. These things had happened, and they were true, and she carried them the way she carried everything, quietly, without complaint, in a place where they could not be lost, but also could not do further harm. The fire cracked and settled in the hearth. The wind moved across the roof and found no way in. Outside, the first snow of the season was falling on the valley, covering the brown grass and the dark river and the fences and the roads in a silence so complete it was almost a sound of its own. And the cabin was warm, and the light from the fire moved across the walls and the floor and the shelf where the meadowlark stood with its beak open, singing a song that only the room could hear. Ilara Kane was 19 years old. She had been cast out with nothing but a blanket and a knife, and $3 in copper coins. And she had walked into a valley she had never seen, and bought a place that no one wanted for a price that no one believed could buy anything worth having. And beneath the floorboards of that place, a woman she would never meet had left her everything she needed. Not just the money, though the money mattered, but the proof that someone had been here before her and had loved this place, and had believed that whoever came next deserved a chance. It was the best $3 she ever spent.